Today will be the last discussion on our discussion on marriage in the contemporary culture. Today will give us what you watch out for. Today's discussion is to help us understand why institutions of value such as marriage cannot be interpreted or judged by our subjective um, power or sense of judgment, because it is an objective institution that is not dependent on us. There are few definitions that we run through our discussions that I would like to bring so that when you hear it, you can have a sense of what they mean. The first one will be inference. And inference, John Newman sees inference as conditional acceptance of a proposition. It means that the acceptance of a proposition is dependent on something. It's not dependent on what you see. It's built upon an already existing proposition. The second definition will be assent. Assent, again, according to John Newman, means the unconditional acceptance of a proposition. In this case, its object is truth. The object of an assent is truth. And then the third will be certitude. Certitude as a form of assent is the unconditional acceptance of the truth of a proposition, with the awareness that one consciously knows that the statement to which one assents to is in fact true. The another definition is simple assent, because John Newman makes a distinction between simple assent and complex assent. With simple assent, he defines as the unconscious acceptance of the truth of a statement. It's unconscious, it flows. We just accept it unconsciously. And then he talks about complex assent as an assent that is made consciously and deliberately. So there is an intentionality when it comes to complex assent. So building upon that, we talk about Newman and why the question of liberalism, the liberal mindset, because that's what he is coming to address. Why? Because the individualism, the challenge of diversity, why people think marriage is a contract, is built upon this liberal mindset or worldview, where people think that realities ought to depend on their own interpretation, in their own thinking or feeling. So Newman knows that this principle of liberal worldview is responsible for the crisis of faith. So he sees it as the challenge, the main challenge of faith. Newman has so many works, but in his book called Apologia, he defined liberal mindset or worldview as the forced liberty of thought, or the exercise of thought upon matters in which from the constitution of the human mind, though cannot be brought to any successful issue, and therefore is out of place. Here he's talking about that there are revealed doctrines which are in their nature beyond and independent of the human mind. And instead of claiming to know it, people tend to push what the mind construct as the objective reality. And he sees that as the challenge, the main challenge of in our faith and the things that the church teaches. In addressing this worldview, David Palin addresses the danger of, he argues that Newman addresses this challenge in this way. He says, liberalism in religion is the doctrine that there is no positive truth in religion, but one creed is as good as another. And this is the teaching that is gaining substance and force daily. It is inconsistent with any recognition of any religion as true. Revealed religion is the truth, but the sentimental and the test, that's what liberal mind pushes, and not an objective fact, not miraculous, and it is in the right of each individual to make it just to make it say just what strikes his fancy. It means that people with the liberal mindset comes to make religion or Christianity per se relative. It's dependent on what strike your fancy. And you see that play out in certain principles or values or doctrines that people get comfortable around. Whatever makes them comfortable, they pursue it. So we come to Newman's discourse on certitude because he builds his argument from addressing liberal mindset to what he calls a certitude. And there he realized the need for unconditional assent as necessary to rediscovering the authenticity of Catholic faith and doctrines. And this he carried out by exploring certitude and what accounts for such in any proposition. In the sixth chapter of one of his works called A Grammar of Assent, he speaks about assent and how it imparts our experience in the journey to accepting what the church teaches, especially values that are objective and independent of our thinking. So one of the quotes he makes is that the circumstances of an act, however necessary to it, do not enter into the act. Assent in its nature absolute and unconditional, though it cannot be given except under certain conditions. It means that, for instance, however our people's nurturing, however their background, however they learn, does not in any way discredit the objectivity of values such as marriage. That however the society tend to push to redefine it, it does not mean that we are the initiators of marriage. Marriage still has its divine origin. So here he talks about the distinction between assent and inference. He argues that assent is unconditional, while inference is conditional. But inference is key element in assenting to any proposition. That's what he argues here. So it's not opposed to each other. It builds on the other. Conditional acceptance gives way to unconditional acceptance. Newman on his own will argue that most of the propositions we think, reason, and act upon, as such, we cannot have undoubted knowledge of their truth. Yet some of them border so near upon certainty that we make no doubt at all about them, but assent to them as firmly and act according to that assent as absolute, as if they were infallibly demonstrated, and that our knowledge of them was perfect and certain. He speaks, his work is somehow technical, but we will get to the point, and that's why I'm trying to, make it practical as much as I can, because Newman tend to be very technical in his choice of words. But what that statement or that quotation is trying to explain is that there will be some tension in what we want to assent to. But the point is that if we allow our consciences to be well formed, they will tell us to assent to it because it is infallibly demonstrated. It means that there will be some sense of peace in the heart, knowing that we are assenting to something that is independent of us and that is true. And one of the ways to know something that is true is the consistency and how constant that thing is. For instance, marriage, as we are talking about, is a truth in itself. And because it has been constant and it is consistent, every culture sees marriage has some connection of the divine to their understanding of marriage. There is some sense of a godly principle attached to marriage. However, the tension between the society tend to push against it. So he speaks of simple assent as non-reflexive appropriation of a statement as true. And that is our everyday living depends on this category of assent. Certain things we say, we just believe without actually thinking about it. And then at certain point, we go back to reflect deep to what we have accepted. So Newman knows that the simple assent, even though it is not certitude, is the foundation of certitude. Because you begin by accepting it, and then you want to understand it. And then you believe it, and then you want to understand it deeper. And you want to understand it more. That's why he thinks and believes that simple assent is the beginning and the foundation of certitude. So it's important to note also that not all simple assents are essentially trustworthy, and they can be reversed upon further question. Just like stated before that our everyday living depends on the category of simple assent. You just, someone tells you something and you just accept it. And then when you go back to reflect on it, you discover that what you believe, you accepted, you were told and you accepted, is not trustworthy after all. What you do, you reverse it, or you trash it, or you discard it. But it's still the foundation to that certitude. The certitude is that upon reflecting on that simple assent, that you have discovered that it's not the truth. And what do? You give it up, because not all simple assents are trustworthy. So he talks about that Newman holds that external evidence alone is insufficient for establishing certitude. So it's not just what you hear, but it's how the mind is formed, how the conscience is formed. Pope Francis, in his work Amoris Laetitia, in inviting the pastors, the priests, to get involved in marriage preparation and in marriage and family life, encourages that they need to pay attention to the challenges of the time and help the faithful to form their consciences so that their assenting to certitude or the objectivity of values or institutions like marriage will come from within, aligning to what comes external. That means when engaged couples come to be prepared for marriage, they have already been forming their consciences to be able to accept what the church is asking of them without so much struggle. And that is why it ought to be emphasized that the church, the family, is this domestic church, because there the faith is embraced, nurtured, and lived out as disciples. So that when the church and the family and the faithful understand that the sacraments are continued, when they are baptized and are getting their faith nurtured in the family that sees itself as the domestic church, at the point of their marriage, they already have some deposit of faith within their heart that when the person preparing them speaks, there is not too much doubts. There is not too much resistance. That's what he is talking about, that external evidence alone is not sufficient. The mind needs to be formed because certitude is not a passive impression made upon the mind from without by argumentative compulsion. No matter how wonderful your argument is, no matter how nice you sound in your marriage preparations, if the person mind and conscience is not a little bit formed, they will accept it because they don't want to make you feel bad, but they don't believe you. And that's what happens when after their wedding, they just go their way and they just do not see the sacrament as a sign and as an instrument. And that's what we need to work on. So he talks about complex assent as different from simple assent. He says it is such an assent that one makes consciously and intentionally, because it's an assent not only to a given statement, but to the claim that the statement which one assents to is in fact true. So you are not accepting that the church says and teach that marriage is a covenant. You are not just accepting it because you don't want anybody to feel bad, but you are accepting it because you know and believe that that is the truth. You believe it. That's what complex assent is, an intentional assent or acceptance of a statement or a claim, knowing that that claim or statement is true in itself. So Newman says that this assent is commonly called conviction. You are convinced within your heart that what you are being told or taught is the truth. There's no doubt. You may not understand it clearly, but you believe that it is true. It's just like the Trinity that we will celebrate on Sunday. You know that it is true, but you do not have the perfect, clear understanding of what that is. So complex assent happens after investigation and rational deliberations on the foundation upon which the proposition is based upon. If the church, if we believe that the church is true, infallible, holy, apostolic, one, and if you believe that Christ is the head of the church, that is the foundation upon which the teachings are to be looked at. That the one teaching this doctrine of faith is true, one, apostolic and Catholic. And that is the four marks of the church. But if we have doubts about the church, it becomes difficult to believe what the church teaches. And that's why John Newman sees the church as a mother. You may not like what your mom says, but you, deep within you, you know that your mother knows what is good for you. You might struggle, but deep within you, you are convinced that your mom knows what is good for you and what is best for you. And that is a convincing truth that all of us, however we want to argue about it, we know that that is the truth. And that's the idea that John Newman is coming from. So he talks about that when a person is certain of a truth, Newman claims that they cannot endure the thought that the contrary opinion may be true. If we understand that what the church is teaching about marriage, the dignity of human body, that God created man and woman, and that God created that marriage ought to be between a man and a woman, and that every other thing that the society is trying to force on the church, that is a contrary opinion. And we know that that is not the truth because we are convinced in the objectivity of what the church is teaching, because it is not dependent on how we feel or how we think or the environment in which the thing is being taught, but because we know that the church is still one, Catholic, apostolic, and true, because we know that. And it's not dependent on how that makes us feel, whether we feel uncomfortable. But deep within us, if we have allowed our conscience to be formed well, we will have that tension, but we will assent to it, and then depending on the grace of God. And that was why last week I was talking about one of the great major distinction between covenant and contract is that contract is dependent on the law, while covenant is dependent on the grace of God. And that's why if we understand that what the church is teaching is true, then it becomes easy to trust in the grace of God, to have a clearer understanding of what we are assenting to. So Newman acknowledges that certitude does not exclude simple assent, but rather they work together to form the certitude or the truth of the church's teaching and beliefs. And because he understood that all these realities are very necessary to understand that the sacrament of marriage is subjective. He talks about that the sacraments are not mere signs, but they are symbols that have deep implications for the church and for the individual. Think of the signpost in your church. The sign, it says St. Bridget Catholic Church. It points to where the church is. It doesn't move. It's a sign. And think of the traffic sign, stop sign, and the yield. That's it. That is a symbol, because they speak more than what they represent. When it says yield, it means slow down, watch, and move. It says stop, it means stop. If you don't stop, you get a ticket. So it speaks more. So when the sacrament, if we understand the objectivity of the sacrament of marriage, it will help us to know why marriage is a sign. And Paul talks about it represents the bond of love between Christ and the church. And that has so much implications on the church itself and on the individuals embracing that sacrament. It means that it is not just anything we do in our own terms, but it means that we ought to align ourselves through the principle of the one who has initiated it. Just like the traffic sign I just spoke of. It means different things in different nations. So if you do not allow yourself to be educated in what it means within a culture, within a place, then you will be suspicious of the demand it makes on you. And that is why we see the resistance among our people to what the church is asking of them in this sacrament called marriage, because they are observing from afar. They don't understand the beauty in that, in just letting God guide you and lead you and carry you, because it is his own making. And because it is his own making, we depend on grace instead of on the law to help us live the demands, the rights and obligations of that. Newman, his reflection as summarized by Castillo in his work, he talks about that nor did early church use the Bible to teach the faith. It was the church that taught what had to be believed. And it only appealed to scripture in vindication of its own teaching. Heretics, those who oppose the church, on the other hand, like the Arians, relied on private study of the Holy Scripture to elicit systematic doctrine from the scattered notices of faith, of truth, which Scripture contains. The parallel with the contemporary situation was obvious. Here is talking about, so that we don't get confused, those who quote the Bible out of context and use it to encourage themselves to remain in their comfort zone. Like all the symptoms that comes with individualistic culture and the challenge of diversity with the multiplicity of cohabitation and the multiplicity of easy divorce. It happens to walk away. And then they will find a way to justify it. It happened even in the past, and it's still happening because people tend to bring their individual interpretation and private interpretation to what ought to be the objective gift of the church to her faithful. So Newman is aware, and he sees the church as the mother and the fullness of sacrament and the sacramental life in the world. So he sees, the sacrament, Christ is the sacrament of God, the church is the sacrament of Christ. And through the wisdom of the church, we are provided the seven sacraments as opportunities and moments of encounter with the living Christ. And then through that encounter, we become the sacrament of the church among the people, that the married couples live out in concrete ways the sacrament of the possibility of the friendship that we share with Christ. And that is what we have as the beauty of the sacrament that we have. So I will end with final points here. The first is that apprehension, tension is necessary in order to ascend to a belief. So when there is that tension within your heart, it's okay. Don't be afraid, but pay attention and make sure that you understand what Christ is asking of you. And then ask yourself, how am I looking at this institution, this value? The second is that ascents that are real are those that are distinct and individual persons. So we appropriate it. That's why in two couples, one understand what the obligations of their union is. The other one is struggling to understand it. It's an individual appropriation, and our job is to witness. Paul tells us to be encouragers, that what we've received, we use that to encourage others. Certitude excludes all doubts. You might have some questions, but you are not doubting what you are believing. You might question, but you are not doubting. It means you are trying to inquire in order to understand better and have clearer understanding. Certitude happens when simple and complex assent act together. And simple assent is the foundation of certitude. And it cannot be defeated. But certitude can be forced, not because they are not real, but because they are founded on faulty reasoning. Truth does not change. It is consistent, it is constant, it is objective. It's not dependent on what we feel. It's not dependent on what we think. And to arrive at a good certitude, the process must be true and good.